One of the first things that I tell my customers is in the cloud era, because it's pay per use, be ready to have a mentality change as far as what your role is going to be. So your role as a technologist will be maintained, but now you have an additional role, which is a business analyst role, for you to weave through all the different pricing in order to really come to an understanding of whether or not it makes sense for us to put things in the cloud, and how do we get the cheapest possible utilization. This is what we want to focus on in this module. So as far as EC2 pricing is concerned, we're going to talk about on-demand instances and what the price is for those types of instances. We're going to talk about reserved instances, how they differ from on-demand, and what are the savings, if any, that happen with reserved instances. We're going to talk about spot instances and what they'll be used for, and miscellaneous pricing as well. And throughout this module, we're going to be referring to the AWS EC2 pricing page that I have on the screen here for you. So let's go ahead and dig into these different instance pricing models and see what each of them offers us. So let's start off with on-demand instances. This is the default type. So, most people, all people will start off with on-demand instances. This is essentially an instance that you just start off with. It's the most expensive option. Now, it's the most expensive option when compared to some of the other instance types that or some of the instance pricing that I'm going to share with you, such as reserved instance. So with an on-demand, there's no commitment. Prices will vary by AWS region. So for example, a region, I don't know, US East might be less expensive than Ireland, or US East might be less expensive than a region in Europe or China, etc. So the prices will vary by region, so keep that in mind. You're billed on an hourly basis, and this is important. So whether you start off that virtual machine or that instance, let's just talk AWS lingo. If you start off that instance and you use it for about 20 minutes and you power it off, you're still going to be charged for that full hour. So as soon as you power it on, you might as well use that full hour. So their increment is a single hour. They can't bill you for less than an hour. So that's something for you to keep in mind. If we come to the webpage I mentioned earlier, up here, you'll find that under the EC2 pricing for on-demand instances, these are some of the pricing that you can expect. And again, you can shift this based on the type of instance that you want. For example, these are Linux instances, and you have, for example, the micro, the medium, etc. It'll give you an hourly rate here of what you're going to be paying for an hourly rate for an instance with this particular configuration. Now you can change it by region, and also you'll see that once you change it, for example, it will update the pricing if there's any update to be made for the hourly. You'll also notice that you can go to Windows, for example, and it'll give you the hourly rating or the hourly rate for the particular Windows instances as well. So on-demand instances are pretty straightforward. You pay for what you use. They're very simple. They're very easy to understand. They're not very complicated, but they're not always the most effective or the most efficient way of utilizing instances on Amazon, especially when you're building an environment that's going to be there for a long period of time. This is where your financial analyst hat needs to come on. This is where you need to understand the interworkings of EC2 pricing in order for you to design an effective pricing solution that meets your needs. So you don't want to put all of your instances on demand. It doesn't make any sense, especially again if you're going longer term. So you would have to understand all of the different options that are available to you, and then design a pricing model or a consumption model that would be the most effective pricing for your particular deployment. That's where my statement of you're not only a technologist at this point, but you also have to be held accountable for pricing. This is the first time that IT is really being held to cost. In the past, with on-premises, we would buy everything. It was a capital expenditure. As long as we justified it and put it in a budget, blah, 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 you deployed that stuff. You didn't really worry about it. And most of the time, it was your directors, your VPs, etc. They just came up and asked, hey, what do you need? Or what do you expect that you need? The cloud changes that. I even foresee that in the future, individual people within the IT department, if not, maybe not individuals in the beginning, but maybe a smaller subset of departments, will be held to a budget. But at one point or another, even individuals will be given a budget of what they can consume in the cloud. And as a result, you would have to put a plan together in order for you to maximize the money that you're being allocated. Now, while on-demand is very straightforward and is very easy to understand, reserved instances are a little more complicated. What we're going to do here together is we're going to dissect it and make it easy for you to digest and understand. But reserved instances is the way you would move forward in order to maximize your savings and take full advantage of the AWS EC2 computing power. So with a reserved instance, it's less expensive. It requires a commitment, however. You have a 1 to 3 years commitment that you would have to sign. It's a contract, essentially. Now, what I recommend here is never to really sign a 3-year contract, because once you sign a 3-year contract, you're locked in. Your rate is locked in. So if Amazon reduces prices within that 3-year period, you don't really take advantage of it. And if we take a look at the history, the track record for Amazon reducing prices, it was something like 42 times in the past year. Right? So I would recommend that you do commitments of up to a year or 1 year, because you only have 1 or 3 years. So there's no 2-year option. So 1 year would be ideal. And as a result, you can adjust after that based on what Amazon, again, adjusts from a price perspective, if they've lowered it or not. And then over time, you can figure, okay, well, Amazon hasn't made a change in 2 years or 3 years. Let's make a 3-year commitment, or the changes that they've made were minimal. We would have taken advantage of a 3-year contract. We would have saved more. At that point, you're beginning to understand. You have a better feel for what's going on, and you can make better decisions. In the beginning, my recommendation would be to commit to a year. You have an upfront cost. So not only are you making a commitment to a contract for 1 to 3 years, there's also an upfront cost. And in exchange for that upfront cost, they're giving you a lower hourly rate. And I'll show you in a little bit how it differs from on-demand hourly rates. But what you're doing here is you're paying an upfront cost for that instance. They're giving you a reduced hourly rate for that instance, and you're locking yourself into a yearly or 3-year commitment. The RIs, the reserved instances, can be sold on the Amazon or the AWS marketplace. What does that mean? Well, let's say you have reserved instances that you're locked into, and for whatever reason you're not using it, the project got canceled, whatever that reason is, but you still have that commitment for a year or for 3 years, but you don't really need it. What you can do is you can put it up for sale on the marketplace. Now, if it happens to be a larger instance, you can break it down into smaller, you can reconfigure it into smaller chunks that you can then resell. Now, keep in mind, it would have to be an attractive cost for whoever is buying it. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense for them to buy it. So there's no way that, if you've made a mistake, you're going to try to, essentially sell your mistake to somebody else. It would have to make financial sense for them to do it. But you can sell your RIs on the AWS marketplace. You commit to utilization. This is very important. We're going to talk about this in the next slide. So before you can understand how to get into reserved instances, you have to understand the utilization profile of that particular instance. You have to figure out, is this something that I'm going to run 24 hours a day? Is this something that I only need to run for 6 hours a day? This is another decision point that you didn't have to make with on-premises. With on-premises, we pretty much built the environment, powered on the virtual machines, and forgot about them. And for most of you, I'm sure you've heard of the word VM sprawl. VM sprawl came from the fact that we never really turned off anything. We never really were accountable for anything. We really didn't take into consideration that, this VM being powered on is consuming CPU, and that in turn is consuming power and requires cooling. There's no accountability. The cloud forces you to be accountable for everything because you're paying for everything. Everything is very transparent. As a result, that forces you to recalculate, rethink whether or not certain instances need to be powered on all the time. Why should you have 20 web servers and all 20 web servers be powered on at all times if you only need 20 web servers once or twice a month? That gets you to think about things. Maybe I can power those off. Maybe I can power those off between the hours of 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning, for example. Again, this is where your design criteria comes into play. Now, as far as utilization is concerned, and here's why it's important. You have 3 levels of utilization that you would have to make a determination as far as which bucket are you going to utilize for a particular instance. You have the light utilization RI. This is ideal for a couple of hours a day usage type thing, maybe a couple of days a week, very light utilization. Then you have the medium utilization. This is ideal for, again, a couple of hours a day, a little more than the light. If the light is twice a week, maybe this is 3 or 4 times a week, for example. And then you have the heavy utilization. With heavy utilization, you are committing to running this instance 100% of the time, and you get the highest savings from this type of utilization. Now, the one thing to note with heavy utilization RIs is if you power it off, it doesn't really matter. You're still paying for 100% utilization. So whether you power it off or not, it doesn't really make a difference, so you might as well just keep it up. With medium and light, you have the ability to power it down, and when you're powering down, you obviously are not paying. Now, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is in the table on the left here. If you take a look, I have the annual utilization in that first column. Now, you'll find that if you're going to be using, for example, an instance for 20% utilization, again, this is annual. If you commit to a medium utilization reserved instance, you would be losing money. This would be, if you're comparing this to on-demand, this wouldn't make any sense because it would be 32%, in the red, right? So you would be losing money. You would be better off going with an on-demand instance. It would be cheaper because by the time you put that upfront cost, yes, you get that reduced hourly rate, but because it's the utilization isn't there, you lose money. For heavy utilization, that's even worse. It's 233%. Now, if you start to go down, you'll find that at 40%, it kind of makes money, right? So you make 5%, over the on-demand. So there's an upside there, but it's really not that big of a deal. You've got minus 66% for heavy utilization, so that's obviously a bad choice. But you'll find from 40% and on for medium, it starts to make sense. And then you'll find that, once you get to 100%, you're getting the most savings if you're going with a heavy utilization. If you're going with a medium utilization, you're getting 27% over on demand. Again, both the medium and the heavy here represent savings over an on demand if you were to run it 100% of the time for the full year or 80% of the time for the full year. Now, back on our website, let me show you here when you come, scroll down to reserved instances, what this looks like, because this is kind of cool. So each one of these types of instances, and you can go with, the T2 micro or whichever one you want, you can scroll down. There's a whole slew of them, right? So let's just pick on M3 large. What it's giving you here is what the upfront cost would be, what the monthly would be, and then what the effective hourly rate would be. Now, this is the important one. Now, remember in the earlier slide, I was showing you kind of that 20%, 30%, 80% annual utilization. Here, they're giving it to you side by side based on the instance type that you're selecting. So you're finding that what your effective hourly rate is. You're taking a look immediately at the savings that you would get over on demand. You're looking at the on demand hourly rate so that you have an opportunity to compare this with the effective hourly rate of this particular instance. So again, they're giving you all the data that's very transparent as far as what you get. And this is for a 1-year term. Now, if you select a 3-year term, you come down here, you'll find, and again, you can compare the 3-year term over the 1-year term and on demand from an hourly rate perspective so that you can see the savings that you're getting. And you also should factor in that upfront cost. Now, again, this might seem like, wow, this is overwhelming. There's a lot of calculations to do. Sure, it might be at first glance, but once you start understanding this, maybe watch this video a few times, it's really not that difficult. But again, this is where you're putting your financial analyst hat on and you're beginning to understand that there are repercussions for just powering on instances. It's not like when it was on, in your on-premises data center where you're just powering something on and you're forgetting about it. In the cloud, there are repercussions from a financial perspective, for just powering something on indefinitely. So you have to classify your servers. You have to figure out, do I need this file server to be on 24/7? Maybe not. Well, if it doesn't need to be on 24/7, how much or how long can I turn it off? Can I turn it off for 8 hours? Yes. Okay. Well, which bucket would that put me in? Probably the medium. Well, then you would make a commitment for that particular instance within the medium bucket. And you go down the list the same way. What I implore you not to do is to not take a checkbox and say, well, all of them have to be powered on all the time. You can do that because it's the easy way out, but it's not the most financially attractive way. This is how you back yourself into a corner and get to a point where you say, you know what, the cloud isn't really saving me money. If you go into the cloud with the same concept, with the same mindset of building your environment in the cloud the same way you've built it on premises, I will absolutely guarantee you before you even embark on this project, the cloud will be more expensive. But if you take some of the principles that I've laid for you and you start to analyze your particular instances and figure out realistically, do they all need to be powered on 24/7, you will find that the cloud will put a dent into the cost of operating your environment. All right, so I want to show you a few more things just to drive this point home and to show you that with a simple spreadsheet, you can punch in some numbers and it will very easily and very clearly become apparent which instance, which reserved instance you should use. So again, I'm just giving you as much information as possible for you to make an educated decision. So if we take some of the examples that I have here, you'll find that in the utilization rate column on the left, if you intend on running an instance for a year for 12 hours or less, you'll find that the on-demand pricing makes the most sense. It's going to cost you $2,678. It makes more financial sense than you're running it medium or high. You'll see that if you go into 1 year, 14 hours, for example, at that point, the medium utilization becomes a lot more attractive. Then it's, you would be saving money if you're running it for that amount of time in the medium column. Now, the interesting thing is if you go, into that light blue, if you're running something for 1 year for 16 hours a day, you're going to be paying on demand $3,571. Now, I don't even want to look at that point, for the medium. Yes, you will save money with the medium, but take a look at this. If you switch it to 24 hours a day for a full year, then with on demand, you'd be paying $5,357, whereas with the medium, you would be paying $3,716, and with the high, you would be paying $3,306. The idea here is if you're going to run it for 16 hours a day and you're going to be paying $3,571, does it make a little more sense to run it 24 hours a day and pay a couple of $100 more for the medium, or pay less if you commit to the high? So take a look. If you run it for 16 hours a day for a full year, on demand, it's going to cost you $35.71, right? If you do 24 hours a day, it's going to cost you $33.06. So you tell me, which one would you choose? So the idea here, again, I'm putting you into that mindset of thinking through these calculations. Now, anything beyond that, you can obviously that, in the orange, it's just going to make more sense to use the high utilization in terms of what will make the most financial sense for you. I want to show you one more thing on that website, awsnow.info, which I think you'll find very interesting as well. Now on this website, if you scroll down all the way to where it says, for example, you have the option here of comparing them almost on the spot. So if you come down to Amazon EC2, you can select Linux, or you can go with Windows, or Windows with SQL, etc. But it puts all the instances side by side. So you'll be able to compare on-demand versus 1 year light, etc. So you'll see all of them again in an easy to read and easy to compare depending on what you're trying to do. You can increase even, how many rows it's showing. But the other interesting thing here is you have a really cool calculator. So you can come in here, you can select the particular region that you want to get pricing for. You can go through the instances, etc. And it will give you, the utilization period, and it will give you the on-demand price, the light, medium, and heavy utilization. So this is, again, a very easy way for you to automatically plug in your numbers, and bada bing, bada boom, you're getting the most up-to-date information. So this is why I kind of saved this website for you, because you can use it to do these types of calculations, or you can build some spreadsheets that will automatically punch in, as soon as you put in numbers, it will automatically tell you which is the best option to go with. So again, it's not a difficult thing to do. What you need to get into the mindset of doing is just to, put in the extra effort of either building that spreadsheet, leveraging some of these online tools, but, gathering the data and making it easy and dynamic for you to get that information, so you're not having to go through the calculations manually, or you're not having to dig through, well, what is the hourly cost today? Well, did Amazon change that hourly cost? You need a dynamic way of doing it, and leveraging these types of websites especially this one, you'll see that it will go a long way in making sure that not only it's making the process easier for you, but it's also making it dynamic, and you're always getting the most up-to-date information. So reserved instances, yes, there's a little more work that you have to put into it, but it might be overwhelming in the beginning, but I promise you it's not that difficult. Spot instances. You're going to like, or you're going to hate, or you're going to be confused about spot instances. But they're actually pretty cool. They're a little weird, but there's a use case for them and they're pretty cool. So let's take a look. So spot instances come from all the unused AWS capacity that's out there. So what AWS does is they have to over provision a lot of capacity in order to make sure that when folks are going in and trying to request instances, Amazon has to make sure that they're able to provision these instances for them. So Amazon always has to over provision. And I find this ironic because one of the things that we tell customers is in the cloud era, you always under provision instead of over provision, as opposed to on-premises data center, we always tended to over provision. But if you think about it, while we, the consumer, are in the cloud era, AWS is in the on-premises era. They still have to build data centers. So they're still following the mentality that we were following when we were building on-premises data center, which is we have to always over-provision in order to take into account all the spikes and the utilization that our customers might use. So I just find that analogy ironic and interesting considering we're in the cloud era, but they're in the on-premises era and they'll always be there. So because they're in the over-provisioning mode, because they have all this unused AWS capacity, they have to be able to kind of monetize that in one way or another. So this is where the idea of spot instances comes into play. They're very cheap hourly rate type of instances. So the difference here between the hourly rate of a spot instance and the hourly rate of on-demand. Remember, with on-demand, I told you, if you power something on and you're using it for 20 minutes and then you power it off, you still pay for that full hour. Well, guess what? With a spot instance, if you power something up and you use it for 58 seconds or 58 minutes, and then you power it off, or not power it off, you get outbid because there's a bidding process, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But if you get outbid at 58 minutes, you don't pay anything. So that hour has to be completed before the billing cycle kicks in. So it's not guaranteed. So again, the idea behind spot instances is they are based on a bidding mechanism. And yes, I am talking about a bid. Similarly, you go to eBay and you put a bid on an item. With a spot instance, you'll find that, okay, there are these available spot instances and they're going for, and I'm just going to throw a number out there, for 1 penny per hour. So you can go in and bid that 1 penny and you can get access to that instance and you'll be able to use it. Now, when I say there's no guarantee, because if someone comes in and outbids you and say, I'm going to pay 2 pennies for this instance, you are immediately kicked out of that instance and they are given access to that instance. Now you're probably thinking about, why would I ever use that? Well, think about it. This would be ideal for raw processing power. This is grid-like applications. If you have applications that need to independently process something, this would be ideal for it. This is very useful in the pharmaceutical, maybe. This is very useful in oil and gas when they're doing research. You'd be able to, again, offload certain tasks onto processing power that's all you need is just raw processing power, and you don't really care if a particular instance fails or not, or if you lose some instances or not. You are just there to process the power as much as possible, to harness that for as long and for as much as possible. So there are ideal use cases for spot instances where they make sense, and even if it gets you get outbid or you get thrown out of an instance, it doesn't really matter. The idea for whoever's using it is to harness that raw processing power for as long as possible. Now, spot instances are also highly scriptable, so you can put bid limitations. You can put on when you power it off, when you power it on. It's very highly scriptable as far as how you can consume it, at what price point you want to get in, what price point you want to get out. So again, because they're geared towards these very specific use cases, you can do a lot of things from a scripting perspective with spot instances. Now, if you take a look at the website for the EC2 pricing and you come down here to spot instances, you'll find that the hourly rate for spot instances for Linux or Windows is ridiculously cheap. And again, you can look at this from a general purpose perspective. So depending on the workload that you're trying to leverage this for, you can use general purpose, or if you wanted something a little more specialized for compute, maybe it's heavy compute, then you can take a look at the hourly rate, and then you can keep going down for GPU, for example, which might be useful. In this case, it's not available, but you get the idea of the utilization. The hourly rate is ridiculously cheap, and it's cheap again because you can get outbooted at any moment or at any second in time, which is why they make this available, and a lot of people are using them for specific use cases. All right, so we've talked about spot instances, we've talked about reserved instances, we've talked about on-demand. Now, it's not the only thing that you have to pay for when you're looking at pricing. There are miscellaneous pricing that you have to take into account as well. So if you go back to the AWS Now website, you'll find that not only do you have to take into account that particular EC2 instance, you also have to take into account some complementary things that go with it, right? So for example, if you're going to be using the Amazon Relational Database service, then you would have to take a look at what it would cost for that particular service, and that would be added on top of EC2. Now remember, with EC2, if you're getting EBS storage, if you're provisioning those volumes, then those volumes aren't free. Remember, the only thing from a storage perspective that's free as far as the EC2 is concerned is what? Anyone? It's ephemeral, right? It's that instant store. That's the only thing that's available for free. So if you provision Amazon EBS storage for a particular instance, then you have to also factor in the price that you're paying for this particular EBS, for instance. If it's optimized, then you click on the optimized tab and you'll be able to tell how much you're paying. So all of these calculations need to be added. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is the transfer rate. Again, that's another thing that you have to factor in when you're looking at your Amazon EC2 pricing. So if you click on the transfer tab here, you'll find that you are not being charged for any kind of traffic inbound. So all the ingress traffic you're not being charged for. You're not even being charged for the first gigabyte, right? So the first gigabyte that you transfer out, you're not being charged for that. Anything from 2 gigabyte essentially up to 10 terabyte, these are the pricing. And you can go to the next tier after that, and the next tier and the next tier, up to the point where Amazon basically says, just contact me if you have more than those requirements. So again, my idea here is that this web page can be leveraged not just for the EC2 instances, but for all the other services that you might be consuming from Amazon. So remember, EC2 is just that virtual machine with its computing power that you're paying for, and whatever local storage, ephemeral storage is there, that's free, so you don't even have to take that into account. But transfer rates, you have to take those into account depending on which category you fall under. EBS storage, you also have to take that into account, because if you have volumes that are attached, then you also have to make sure that you're taking those into account when you're calculating the price of EC2. So this is where folks get a little overwhelmed from an AWS pricing perspective. This is where folks kind of falter and say, you know what, this is not making any sense, or they give up and they move on. The fact is, if you calculate these properly, this will make a lot of sense, but you have to take the time to actually go through this exercise. All right, we've talked about a lot of stuff. What do you guys think we bring this home? I think it's time. Let's do it. So I hope at the end of this module, you're not overwhelmed with EC2 pricing. I hope I did a good enough job to simplify it, to give you all the data points, give you all the tools, point you in all the right directions, and all the right advice for you to make the right determination, and to really understand that it's not really that complicated. It does require some time. It will require some effort on your behalf, but once you have a system in place, once you have your spreadsheets, your go-to websites, and everything kind of fits in place, you'll find it's not that difficult. So let's kind of bring this full circle and wrap it up. We talked about on-demand instances. The fact is, on-demand instances are the easiest to understand. That's probably where everybody starts. You're essentially paying for whatever you're using, and it's going to be the most expensive. It's based on an hourly usage, which means if you use your machine for, I don't know, 5 minutes, you're going to be billed for that full hour, so might as well use the full thing. We talked extensively about reserved instances. Reserved instances have an upfront cost, and they have a 1 or 3 year commitment contract that you have to also go into. But they give you a significantly lower hourly rate, and they're available in either light, medium, or high. So you'd have to figure out the profile of the instance and figure out whether it's a light, medium, or high to see if reserved instances make any sense or not. Well, I gave you a lot of examples. We showed you a lot of calculations that you can do off of awsnow.info. I showed you the EC2 pricing webpage that compares the reserved instances hourly rate versus the on-demand hourly rate on a particular instance type. So we went into great detail as far as reserved instances are concerned. And then we talked about spot instances. Spot instances are those instances that you bid on. The idea behind spot instances, though, if you get outbid, you're immediately going to be booted out of that server and someone else will use it. It has a ridiculously low hourly rate, and it comes from the fact that Amazon AWS has excessive capacity that they need to get rid of, and it's ideal for use cases where you need access to raw computing power, and you don't really care if that instance gets lost or not. You just need that raw power. We also talked about the fact that you have to factor in other services. For example, if you're using an instance and you have EBS storage attached to it, then EBS storage and an added costs that you have to include on top of what you're paying for EC2. So you have to factor all of those into account. Finally, I hope this module was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.